In the late summer of 1903, a lawyer and amateur naturalist named Frank Springer walked into the Cerrillos Hills south of Santa Fe, New Mexico, with a survey assistant, a hand compass, and a mule loaded with field gear. Springer had spent decades in the territory by that point, long enough to know its geology with a professional precision most trained geologists could not match, and what had drawn him to the Cerrillos Hills that season was a note forwarded from the Smithsonian Institution suggesting that the turquoise workings there were considerably larger and considerably older than anything in the existing literature had found adequate language to convey. He spent 8 days walking the interior slopes before he wrote back to Washington. His note said the Smithsonian's characterization had undersold the case. What Springer found in those hills was evidence of extraction on a scale the desert conceals until you are standing inside it. The low ridges that appear from the road like ordinary broken terrain reveal themselves on foot as a landscape of deliberate intervention. Pits cut into the hillside in dense clusters along the ridgetops and down the southern faces, running in patterns that speak of systematic search rather than casual prospecting. The walls of each pit show the rounded chipping characteristic of stone hammerwork, a surface that looks nothing like the sheared faces left by iron tools and everything like the result of cobble struck against cobble over long periods of sustained labor. Around the pit mouths lie the waste piles, the spent host rock from which the turquoise was separated, and among the waste, everywhere and in quantity, the hammerstones themselves. River cobbles ranging from a single pound to 15 pounds, smooth on the working face, often split along that face from the accumulated force of repeated blows. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Cerrillos Hills sit in Santa Fe County, 17 miles south of the city, and they hold what geologists and archaeologists have documented as the largest and oldest turquoise mining district on the North American continent. The stone extracted here did not stay in the region. Geological fingerprinting work, conducted across several decades, most precisely in a series of studies published between 1980 and 2010, matched the isotopic and trace element signature of Cerrillos turquoise against samples from sites spanning the full extent of the prehistoric Southwest and deep into Mesoamerica, turning up matches in burial goods recovered from Chaco Canyon, in ceremonial deposits across southern Arizona, and in the imperial collections associated with the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. Some portion of the turquoise connected with the regalia of the Aztec Emperor Montezuma, objects gathered in the 16th century and now distributed across European museum holdings, carries a geochemical signature pointing to these New Mexico hills. The stone removed from the Cerrillos pits traveled more than 1,000 miles south and entered the most powerful ceremonial economy on the continent. The mines are old in a way that does not reveal itself at first encounter. The oldest tools recovered from below datable organic layers at Cerrillos, stone mauls and pecking implements found beneath material susceptible to radiocarbon analysis, push the beginning of systematic extraction at this site back to approximately 6,000 years before the Common Era. Some stratigraphic estimates, based on the depth and character of the oldest undisturbed assemblages, extend that figure to 8,000 years before the present. To place that date in context, it predates Stonehenge by 4,000 years. The first writing systems were still 2,000 years in the future. At the moment, the earliest miners of the Cerrillos Hills were learning to follow turquoise veins into the rock. The oldest civilization's history records were still being assembled out of mud brick and early arithmetic in river valleys on the other side of the world. The tradition of extraction that began in these hills ran without documented interruption for 80 centuries. What 80 centuries of extraction leaves in the physical record is, in the case of Cerrillos, measurable in precise terms. A structural survey completed by the New Mexico Bureau of Mines and Mineral Resources in 1991, working from the geometry of the surviving pits and the volume of waste rock in the surrounding piles, estimated total material displacement from the district across its full working history at something in excess of 100,000 tons. The turquoise-bearing rock removed in the course of following the veins accounted for between 15 and 20,000 tons of that total. These figures come not from documentary records but from the physical form of the land itself. The shape of what is missing in the rock tells you the size of what was taken. The method used to remove that stone was consistent across the district's full working life, refined over time but built on the same core sequence. Fires were set against the turquoise-bearing rock face to heat it. The heated stone was then doused with water to introduce thermal fracture lines through the shock of the sudden temperature change. The hammerstones were applied to the fractured surface, blow after careful blow, working along the vein as each section yielded. What later surveyors noted was that the orientation of the pits along the vein systems showed a geological reading of the stone's behavior in the host rock that could only have accumulated across generations. The deepest cuts follow the turquoise seam through directional changes in the bedrock, with the confidence of people who had watched someone else make exactly this decision before them. Not a guess at where the stone would run, a transmission of knowledge about where the stone already had. Turquoise is soft as minerals go, a copper aluminum phosphate workable without high heat or metal tools, and the volcanic host rock surrounding it was what the fire, water, and hammer work was directed at separating it from. Labor at that scale, sustained across that duration, does not happen without people living somewhere near the work. This is the central observation around which every careful examination of the Cerrillos mines eventually arrives and then stops. The extraction is documented. The duration is documented. The destination of the product is traceable in museum holdings and burial records across 2 countries. What is not documented anywhere is the record of the people who did the work. No hearths, no ash layers, no food bone in any quantity consistent with a working population. No compressed soil layers of the kind that form beneath areas of regular habitation. No plant residue from prepared meals. No trash middens of the type that accumulate at any inhabited location within a season or 2 of regular use. Not one grave of a worker who died at the site and was interred where they fell. No post holes, no wall stubs, no floor surfaces modified for shelter. In 8,000 years of documented productive extraction, at a site that supplied turquoise to half a continent, the material record of the workers themselves is effectively absent. What makes this absence specific rather than general is what does survive at other sites of comparable age in the same region. The dry climate of northern New Mexico is favorable to the long-term preservation of organic material. Charred wood survives here across thousands of years. Animal bone survives. Compressed ash layers survive. Ground stone fragments, the worn stubs of grinding tools used across many seasons, survive with enough detail that the type and period of their manufacture is readable in the stone. All of these materials appear in abundance at other ancestral Puebloan sites of comparable age and lesser significance than the Cerrillos mines. Their absence from the mine district is not a function of preservation conditions. The climate that kept charred wood intact at nearby Pueblo sites would have kept it intact here as well. What time could not account for, the workers did. Edgar Lee Hewitt, founding director of the School of American Research in Santa Fe, directed the first systematic archaeological study of the Cerrillos district in the early decades of the 20th century. Hewitt had spent 30 years excavating across the Southwest and had developed the professional habit of understatement with anomalies, the kind of measured language that keeps a researcher's colleagues from dismissing him before he has made his point. Writing in his summary report on the district in the 1920s, he observed that the workings presented a peculiar character in that no domestic archaeological evidence of any kind had been identified within the mine area or its immediate surroundings. He described the situation as requiring further study. He listed other priorities. The further study his observation demanded was never undertaken on the scale it required. The note did not advance because the institutional machinery of American archaeology in that era was not built to investigate the absence of evidence as evidence in itself. Survey programs were built to document what was present, to measure artifacts and record occupation sequences, and publish stratigraphic findings. A site with no domestic occupation layer was, by the logic of the prevailing funding structure, a site with nothing to excavate. The Cerrillos district offered pits and hammerstones and waste rock. What it did not offer was the kind of material that filled reports and justified return visits. The absence was noted, filed, and left where it was. For a site worked intermittently across a few decades, that absence might be explained without difficulty. A crew arriving in warm weather, spending a few weeks cracking rock and filling carry bags, and returning to their home village without leaving a fire pit behind, would produce a thin record, possibly invisible in the soil. Brief extraction visits of that kind are documented at other sites in the region, and their material signature is minimal, almost to the point of undetectability. But Cerrillos was not worked for a few decades or a few centuries. The tool assemblages recovered from the district represent multiple distinct technological traditions, separated by thousands of years. The pits cut across each other in sequences showing repeated opening, clearing, and reopening at intervals. The stratigraphy cannot date precisely, but every relative indicator reads as long. The hammerstones in the waste piles come from at least 3 distinct manufacturing periods. This was not a brief visit to a convenient vein. It was a relationship with this ground maintained across more time than separates us from the Roman Empire, and maintained apparently without ever leaving the domestic residue that any sustained human presence anywhere reliably produces. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. William Henry Holmes arrived in the Cerrillos Hills in the late 1890s, sent by the Bureau of American Ethnology at the Smithsonian Institution to survey Aboriginal mining sites across the Southwest. Holmes was a field researcher who measured before he concluded and documented before he theorized, and his reports to the Bureau reflect the discipline of a man who understood exactly how much each statement would cost him if it turned out to be unsupported. His account of the Cerrillos visit, submitted to the Bureau and preserved in their published records, noted that the district exceeded in extent any turquoise mining operation he had encountered in the Southwest, that the depth and density of the pits implied a working history of considerable antiquity, and that the quantity of material extracted, estimated from the physical dimensions of the waste piles and the cut faces, substantially exceeded what could be accounted for in the known archaeological record of turquoise objects across the continent. In the middle of that report, in a single sentence, he noted that no domestic occupation evidence of any kind had been encountered at or near the mine workings. He then continued to the next site on his survey list. That sentence has been available in the Bureau's published records for more than a century. Every systematic study of the Cerrillos district conducted since has confirmed its essential accuracy. The mines are there, the tools are there, the waste rock is there, the turquoise is somewhere else, and nothing in the record of the connection between those two endpoints tells you who organized it or where they lived while doing so. The destination of the stone is at least traceable. At Chaco Canyon, 150 miles to the northwest, excavations beginning in the 1890s and continuing through the following century recovered turquoise in quantities that changed how archaeologists understood the site's function. The great houses of Chaco, Pueblo Bonito most prominently, contained caches of finished pendants and beads, numbering in the tens of thousands across the full excavation record. The workshop debris, the tiny chips and trimming fragments that accumulate wherever turquoise is shaped by practiced hands, ran to hundreds of thousands of individual pieces in the published reports. Joan Mathian, a researcher associated with the National Park Service's Chaco project, estimated in a study published in 2001 that the total weight of turquoise recovered from Chaco in all excavations since the 1890s exceeded 50 kilograms of finished and semi-finished material. She noted this represented only what survived in excavated contexts, recovered and catalogued, a fraction of a larger original whole whose scale could not be reconstructed from the surviving assemblage. The source of most of that material was Cerrillos. Isotopic and trace element studies conducted since the 1980s have consistently pointed the majority of Chacoan turquoise back to the New Mexico hills. This means that Chaco, the most architecturally complex society the prehistoric Southwest produced, was drawing the material at the center of its ceremonial economy from mines that show no record of the organization required to supply it reliably across centuries. The Chacoan road system adds another layer to this. That network of broad, straight pathways cut into the desert surface, engineered without apparent regard for topography, running for many miles in some segments without a change of direction, represents one of the most unusual engineering achievements of prehistoric North America. Researchers mapping the road system in the early 1980s found that several routes projected outward from the canyon toward the southeast, in alignments that, followed through their surviving segments, point toward the Cerrillos district. The most direct reading of this evidence is a deliberate supply corridor maintained across the peak centuries of Chaco's influence, moving turquoise along engineered roads from the mine hills to the canyon. The roads are documented, the mines are documented. The connection the road alignments imply is the most direct interpretation of what the physical evidence shows. A supply connection of that kind requires logistics, movement across 150 miles of high desert, sustained across centuries, requires waypoints, water sources, and staging areas, the kind of infrastructure that generates archaeological evidence wherever people stop regularly, occupation debris, fire pits, cached tools, the compressed soil of repeated use. Some intermediate sites have been identified along the projected road routes, small communities whose position suggests a logistical function. None of them has produced evidence of turquoise organization or mine management. The road leads toward the mines produce the stone. In the space between those two documented facts across the centuries their connection ran, the material record of how the operation was organized remains absent. An art historian named J.J. Brodie encountered this problem while researching turquoise's role in ancestral Puebloan ceremonial practice in the 1970s. His primary subject was painted ceramics, and the Cerrillos question lay at the edge of his material. He named it in a footnote, describing what he called a production mystery, a case where the receiving end of the trade was well documented, but the production end offered no account of the human organization that supplied it. His main argument lay elsewhere, and the footnote was the only place he pressed on the point. When a later edition of his work appeared in the following decade, the footnote was unchanged. The problem it named was unchanged with it. The situation Brodie's footnote names does not belong to the Cerrillos district alone. Two other major prehistoric turquoise sources in the southwest show comparable patterns. The Sleeping Beauty turquoise deposit in the Globe Miami district of Arizona was worked by indigenous people for at least 3,000 years before 20th century commercial operations began. Archaeological surveys conducted there in the 1950s and again in the 80s documented extensive prehistoric workings spanning multiple periods of technology, with the same notable absence of domestic occupation evidence at the mine site. The Mount Chalchihuitl locality within the Cerrillos district itself, a separate mining focus a short distance from the main workings, was excavated by the School of American Research in the 1920s and produced the oldest datable turquoise mining evidence then recorded in the region. Again no hearths, again no sleeping surfaces, again the production debris present and the living record removed. What the evidence across these sites describes is an extraction system that cleared itself after every working period, not a system that lost its domestic record to time. The materials that survive 8,000 years in the dry hills of northern New Mexico are known. Charred wood survives, animal bone survives, compressed ash survives, ground stone fragments survive. These appear at other sites of comparable age across the region. They are not present in the mine areas. Time did not remove them. What distinguishes the Cerrillos district and its counterparts from the broader Puebloan archaeological record is not the difficulty of preservation, it is the consistent, site after site, century after century absence of the domestic record that any human population produces wherever it stops long enough to work. The distinction between a site abandoned in place and a site systematically cleared is one any experienced excavator reads in the character of the soil itself. A site abandoned in place develops a characteristic profile, organic material mixed through the upper deposits, artifact distributions reflecting how things were dropped and left, occasional concentrations marking activity areas. A cleared site looks different. The surface reads as worked but not inhabited. What is present is precisely what a working crew would leave if it removed everything that retained value: the spent hammerstones, the waste rock too heavy to move, the turquoise dust too fine to gather. Production residue stays, living residue goes. At the Cerrillos district, across 8,000 years of documented use, the soil profile reads as cleared rather than abandoned, and it reads that way not once but across the full documented duration of the workings. What was taken out of this ground was the turquoise. What was taken out with equal consistency was every indication that any person had ever been here. Frank Springer returned to the Cerrillos Hills for a final time in 1915. His published note from that visit, which appeared in a journal of New Mexico natural history the following year, observed that the prehistoric miners had followed the turquoise veins to depths the commercial operators of his day had not yet equaled, and that the tool assemblages from the deepest cuts reflected a systematic knowledge of where the stone would run in the rock, a knowledge that could only accumulate across many generations of sustained work in the same ground. He did not speculate about where those generations slept, what they called themselves, or where their dead were buried. The survey had not called for that. It has not called for it since. A pendant recovered from Pueblo Bonito during excavations conducted by the Hyde Exploring Expedition in the late 1890s is held today in the collections of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. It is 5 centimeters long, polished on both faces, and drilled through the narrow end with a hole whose interior walls show the calibrated, steady pressure of a trained hand working with a tool made for precisely this purpose. A geochemical study published in 2008 traced the material of this piece to the Cerrillos district, with a confidence the researchers described as high. The person who made it knew turquoise the way you know a material through long practice. They knew where a piece would accept the drill and where it would split along an interior fracture. They knew how to read the color gradient through the outer surface to find where the vein ran clean. They left this object in a context that preserved it across 1,000 years. They left nothing of their own daily life anywhere the record has so far found them. The pits are still open in the Cerrillos Hills. The waste rock piles still carry the faint blue-green staining where the turquoise dust pressed itself into the surface over centuries of crushing and sorting. The hammerstones still lie where they were left, each one smoothed on its working face by the same motion applied until the cobble gave out. 8,000 years of those motions. 8,000 years of people climbing these slopes in the warm months, reading the veins, following the stone deeper into the rock, loading out everything that mattered, and leaving behind only what they could not carry. The turquoise they removed is in museums across 2 countries and in collection drawers whose contents have never been fully published. It is in the pendants and beads recovered from Chaco, in the grave goods of leaders interred far to the south, in the Aztec collections now distributed across European institutions that have not always inquired precisely where their objects originated. All of that stone had a beginning in these hills, in these pits, in the hands of a succession of people whose organizational capacity supplied the most powerful ceremonial economy in the prehistoric Southwest, for centuries without leaving any trace of the daily lives they led in the course of doing it. The scale of the work is in the ground, the discipline of the clearance is in the ground alongside it. What the 2 things together require of the existing record is an accounting it has not yet produced. 8,000 years of extraction, 2,000 pits, 100,000 tons of displaced rock, a pendant in a New York museum linked by chemistry to this hillside, and the ground of the Cerrillos Hills holding everything that happened here with the completeness of a record designed to contain nothing at all. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.